Stories from Maine is a collection of true tales and legendary stories of daring, heroism, absurdity, disaster, and spectacle, all proving why many of the greatest legends in American history are our stories from Maine. In June of 1936, during the midst of the Great Depression, a community day of fun and excitement suddenly turned into one of the worst tragedies ever recorded in Maine history. When it was over, 12 school children were dead, and many Washington County families were forever changed. Stay with us now and hear the true story of the Pearl Beach drownings. Next, on this all-new episode of Our Stories from Maine. Our podcast begins right now.
This is our Stories from Maine weekly podcast for the second week of March, 2025. Stories from Maine is authored by historian Lori Suzanne Dell. Her books, Stories from Maine and Stories from Maine 2, as well as all of her books, are available through book retailers and can be found on Amazon. The all-new book, Stories from Maine 3, Mayhem, Murder, and Execution in the Pine Tree State, will publish in May of 2025. You can follow Stories from Maine on Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, and Spotify at Stories from Maine. And now, you can also find Stories from Maine on TikTok. Now, let's head over to James for another segment of This Week in Maine History.
In this segment of This Week in Maine History, we look back on March 11th of 1936. After a heavy winter, the start of a 3-day rainstorm, combined with warmer temperatures, sees lakes and rivers overflow their boundaries, as serious flooding begins to take a toll on the state of Maine and New England. The Kennebec River Bridge linking Richmond to Dresden is completely washed away, and the Androscoggin River in Auburn reaches its highest level on record, and wipes out a railroad bridge and a historic footbridge in Brunswick. The floods affect much of the East Coast, as far south as Virginia. When the flood waters finally recede a week later, more than 150 people were dead, including 5 persons here in Maine. Dams had burst, roads were destroyed, businesses were ruined, and many homes were washed away in this historic flood. Now, let's head over to Oscar for this week's feature story of the Pearl Beach drownings.
On Friday, June 19th of 1936, during the midst of the Great Depression, one of the most terrible disasters in Maine's history had taken place. Suddenly, a wonderful day of festivities turned into a horrific disaster. The day had begun as a school outing, a way to celebrate the last day of school. And for the many scores of people who came out that day, the planned picnic was a way to help forget the cold winter that had just passed and the heavy weight of the financial turmoil of those economic times. These were the early days of the 20th century, and many rural towns still made use of smaller schoolhouses, where numerous grades were taught together. On this day, students from 4 different schools of Lubec were taking part in this celebratory picnic. The children were as young as 8, with the oldest about 16 years. 15 of these students had traveled with 3 of their teachers, and many of these children were accompanied by family members to this Washington County lake in East Machias. While the women talked and set out their picnic feasts, many of the men engaged in a big topic of conversation. Later that night, heavyweight boxing champion Joe Louis was scheduled to fight German heavyweight champion Max Schmeling, and the topic for many of these men was a hot one. All in all, well over 100 people had gathered to enjoy the day. And it was not the first time this trip had been made for a similar celebration with Lubec's children. Mothers had worked all week to prepare for this day. Picnic baskets had been prepared with the best of what families could gather. Sandwiches, jams, homemade potato salad, fresh-baked breads and cakes, pickles, and other delicacies were all made and packed for the day. Jars of lemonade, bottles of soda pop, and jugs of iced tea were carefully packed, and many even lit barbecues to cook upon. On the sunny knoll, many had spread out their blankets upon the thick green grass and then laid out in the bright and warm sunshine. This day of fun and socializing with friends, neighbors, and coworkers had allowed even the adults to enjoy the festivities of the day. Games of horseshoes, checkers, and tug-of-war were set up. Games of catch and dodgeball kept many of the kids entertained as well. And in those early days, many children, as well as many adults, had not been taught how to swim, even though coexisting with the waterways of down East Maine was a way of life. Also attending this picnic was a local man, 50-year-old Cavalier London, who had taken part in many of these annual school festivities. London enjoyed taking children out in his small outboard boat to enjoy a fun ride on the lake. In fact, London had already made 4 trips out onto the lake that day with other students, and now he was heading back to take out another group. However, a fierce wind had begun blowing across Gardner Lake that day, and the water became choppy and white caps were blanketing the surface of the lake, and the water was still terribly cold. Yet, the sun was out, and many of the children wanted to go out on the boat, and the adults did not want to disappoint the kids. Once London had unloaded one group of kids, another group climbed aboard. These children found their seats in the small dory boat, and London restarted the outboard. After a few warnings to sit down, the loaded boat took off. Within minutes, London piloted the boat around a small peninsula and past the beachhead. He was now steering the dory out into the deeper portion of the lake. What would happen next stunned the crowds and turned the pleasant day at Pearl Beach into a historic and horrific day of tragedy. We'll be right back.
We hope you are enjoying this episode of our free podcast. Please help us in bringing you more episodes by liking, subscribing, following, and commenting on our Stories from Maine content on Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, TikTok, and Spotify. Your interaction allows us to keep our podcast free for all to enjoy. Now, let's go back to James for another segment of This Week in Maine History.
Let's now revisit March 12 of 1888, when the great blizzard of that year, a 2-day storm also known as the Great White Hurricane, brought much of the east coast of the United States, including Maine, to a complete standstill. At New York City, 15,000 people are stranded in subways, as over 22 inches of snow buried streets, and heavy winds created massive snowdrifts. In Maine, nearly 2.5 feet of snow closed towns, cities, marine ports, and killed large numbers of livestock. When it was over, more than 400 people had died, and the economic loss to Maine and the Northeast was astounding, reaching nearly $100 million. Now, let's return to Oscar, who has the heart-wrenching conclusion of our feature story.
Back at Pearl Beach, while Callie London continued piloting his boat full of children out into the deeper portion of the lake, most of the teachers and family members on land were paying little attention to the boat or to the children who seemed to be enjoying the ride. Yet, some were watching, and many were waving as the children were laughing. Suddenly, a huge and sustained gust of strong wind blew across the lake and caught the broadside of the small dory boat, lifting the bow perilously high into the air. Children were quickly tossed backwards in the boat as the stern suddenly dipped below the surface of the lake, and water began to fill the boat. The motor soon flooded and conked out, and London was thrown backwards into the water. As children began spilling out into the chilly lake, the boat suddenly twisted in the wind before the bow settled back down, and the boat overturned, plunging all of the children into the cold and choppy water. Many of the children were immediately trapped under the overturned boat, while a few were now struggling to keep their heads above water. Spectators on the edge of the lake were quickly alarmed to action. Many jumped immediately into the lake as they hurried to reach the children. As the boat foundered, It lost buoyancy and much of its hull dipped low into the lake, while a few of the children were still trapped underneath. Callie London had regained his buoyancy and he tried to grab as many children as he could, while spectators, now impromptu rescuers, frantically struggled to reach the children and pull them from the water. Also standing on the beach when the small boat overturned was Wyman Ramsdell, a high school student and former Boy Scout, who quickly jumped into action. Ramsdell swam as fast as he could and quickly reached Miriam Kelly. Kelly was sinking under the water's surface, and she had felt her life leaving her, when suddenly a hand reached down into the agitated water and grabbed a handful of her hair. Ramsdell had located her under the surface and was now pulling her upward. Kelly had swallowed a lot of lake water, but soon revived. One of the teachers, Miss Stella Burho, also standing on the beach, immediately stripped off her outer clothing and jumped into the cold water and began swimming frantically to reach the endangered children. Burho grabbed onto two of the female children and removed them from the water and brought them onto the shore. When word of the tragedy reached town, an alarm was sounded. Quickly, police, firefighters, and Coast Guardsmen from the local station all rushed to the scene of the tragedy at Pearl Beach. Doctors and nurses were also summoned, and each raced to Gardner Lake. Many of the picnic goers, still struggling to locate and pull children from the water, worked furiously. Many attempts to resuscitate these unconscious children were being made, but hardly anyone present knew how to properly perform any sort of resuscitation. When first responders finally arrived, the firemen, policemen, and Coast Guardsmen all worked in vain to establish a pulse, to restore breathing, and to revive these children of Lubec. Firefighters and police officers worked ceaselessly while doctors and nurses did all they could and were trained to do. In the end, only Calvin London and 3 of the 12 children, 2 girls and a boy, had survived the desperate tragedy. A day that had initially begun with happiness and the sounds of laughter had suddenly ended with sadness and the cries of grief. Now, 5 girls and 7 boys lay lifeless. One family, the Mahar family, lost both a son and a daughter on that terrible day. And a few of the children's bodies had still not been reached, nor had their remains surfaced from the darkened depths of Gardner Lake. Members of the United States Coast Guard, working with local firefighters, all worked together to drag the lake in an attempt to recover the lifeless bodies of the missing children. Finally, as evening settled in, all of Lubec's dead were recovered, and their bodies returned to the beach, where hearses and ambulances would carry them home to Lubec and their final rest. The next day, newspapers from New York to Washington State had all printed the tragic headlines, which told the gruesome tale of these 12 Lubec children, who were all pulled from the cold water of Pearl Beach at Gardner Lake in East Machias. When word of the tragedy had reached the White House at Washington, D.C., the report of the loss of these children of Lubec had stunned President Franklin Roosevelt. For Roosevelt, he had visited Lubec many times, as his coastal vacation home on Campobello Island was reached by a small bridge connecting the island to Lubec. Roosevelt is believed to have known many of the families who were now grieving for the loss of their children, and it is said that FDR wept at his desk that day. 2 days later, on Sunday, June 21st, the funeral for 9 of these young victims was held at the Split Hill Cemetery in Lubec. 2 of the children were buried in West Lubec, and 1 was buried in nearby Trescott. And the sadness of this tragedy got even worse, as just a few weeks later, 2 more children, in a completely unrelated incident, also drowned at Pearl Beach. Now, nearly 90 years after the tragic drowning of these 12 children at Pearl Beach on Gardner Lake, the names of these victims are still well remembered by the people of Lubec and of East Machias by a plaque dedicated to this tragic and senseless loss of life. Yet, the story of this tragedy has been largely forgotten. But today, the tragic loss of these 12 school children on what was to have been such a happy day is now remembered as one of the saddest and most deadly of our Stories from Maine.
In this last segment of This Week in Maine History, we travel back to March 13 of 1877, when a Farmington, Maine teenager, Chester Greenwood, suffers from cold ears while enjoying Maine's great outdoors. In an attempt to find a remedy for this common problem, Greenwood fashions wire and cotton into a warm covering and creates a center hinge, which helps to keep the device snug to his ears. Greenwood's invention is quickly named the Greenwood earmuffs, for which he receives a patent, and soon after opens a factory that employs many in the town of Farmington. Greenwood's earmuffs go on to worldwide sales and creates a warm spot in American history.
Our Stories from Maine podcast streams each Saturday, with all new weekly podcast episodes. Until then, please join us, and nearly 40,000 others, by following us on our Facebook page, for daily content from Maine's great history. And please like, comment, and subscribe to our podcast on our YouTube and Spotify channels. You can also find our books, Stories from Maine, and Stories from Maine 2, The Legends Continue, as well as all of Laurie Suzanne Dell's books, through all book retailers and on Amazon. All original Stories from Maine content is copyright 2025, with all rights reserved. Stories from Maine is a registered trademark of Laurie Suzanne Dell. You may contact Stories from Maine by emailing storiesfrommaine@gmail.com. See you next week, and thank you for listening.